The recent American Rescue Plan, the same legislation just mentioned a moment ago, appropriated $350 billion to state and local governments. The statutory text at issue permitted this funding to be used to, quote, make necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure, close quote. To my knowledge, there were no limits placed in the statutory text around the vague, broad phrase, investments in broadband infrastructure. Mr. O'Reilly, is overbuilding of broadband networks a possibility from this language? And how does overbuilding affect the overall broadband market? That is, how does it affect market competition?
Subsidized overbuilding, which this would be, absolutely, is likely to come from this. We've already seen a number of entities raise their hand and say, I want that money to go for broadband purposes in areas that they already have networks. So it will depress the existing provider, potentially in small instances or in smaller providers, potentially threaten their viability to serve. It could certainly steal the major businesses in the area that they rely on to be the funding source for going forward. So subsidized overbuilding is incredibly problematic for areas. These are areas that we generally say we're trying to target the unserved population where you can't have one provider doesn't exist without subsidies. But here you're talking about money going to wherever they want within a state, incredibly problematic. No limitations. I'm hopeful that they'll appear, and maybe because of reconciliation they couldn't be added, but it's incredibly problematic.
There are private sector business interests at companies that spend billions of dollars in the form of investments in their own broadband networks. Is that safe to say?
Oh, absolutely.
And so what's the effect of federal spending on private sector investment in this area? Is there a disincentive that's created by that?
Oh, absolutely. And it also targets which markets they may go into based on what the activity of the state is. So if a state's been given carte blanche and therefore they're going to use these dollars for broadband overbuild, then you're going to see dollars go elsewhere, and the consumers trying to compete with these two systems now.
Separate and apart from what it might choke out, is this increased federal spending something that has the capacity to artificially divert resources toward inefficient purposes?
Oh, absolutely. In some instances, you would see the providers react and try to compete against this government network. In some instances, if it is, or whoever has been picked to be the winner, build out this new provider. And you may see them dedicate resources and lower the costs in some instances to try and compete against it. And that will be an inefficient mechanism that the government is causing.
Let's talk about the video marketplace for a minute. Our current video marketplace is governed by Title VI of the Communications Act, and it dates mostly back to a law that Congress passed back in 1992. But technology has, of course, changed rather considerably since 1992. And now the same wire that used to just bring video into American homes is also bringing a whole host of other services as well. Would you agree that Congress really ought to be taking up reforms to Title VI, and that doing so could help in our efforts to bring more effective broadband deployment?
Yes, absolutely. I support, and if I were to spend, if I were still at the commission, that was something I was going to spend more time on. I think it's absolutely critical that we recognize the vast number of competitors that are not regulated by Title VI, competing against those that are, and the relief that should be provided to existing providers, legacy providers, those that have the network, versus the streaming companies and otherwise in other technologies, whether it be wireless or elsewise. So I absolutely agree that Title VI should be reformed. It should be high on the priority list.
Do you have anything within your priority list of things that we ought to try to tackle first in that area?
In that area, yeah, I would be happy to follow up with you in terms of different ideas that we should look at in terms of reform. There are a bunch of things that, first priority would be like scrape away any existing regulation or statutory obligation that makes no longer any sense. Two would be to completely revamp that title to reflect the current marketplace. And those decisions have to be reflected in other decisions the commission makes, whether it be media ownership, whether it be how DOJ, treats the marketplace. So those things can flow through in other instances.
And Mr. O'Reilly, what are the top spectrum policy changes that you think Congress ought to undertake now if we're to have any hope in being able to compete with the rest of the world in deploying next generation technologies?
Well, I do believe that the Congress and certainly the FCC will have these fights going forward, but we're going to need to reallocate additional federal spectrum that's used by agencies to commercial purposes. That's been an ongoing fight. You and I have talked about the valuation bill that you've been so leading the charge on and so appreciative. But those fights are going to continue because the demand for wireless services is going to continue to increase, and the benefits from those networks, not only just in terms of consumer benefit, but also the emergency communications and everything that goes from that, and the decreased need on the more efficiency needed from the federal agencies is absolutely critical, and we're going to have that fight. And so I'd be decreasing the amount of spectrum allocated for federal purposes.
Would it be an overstatement to suggest that our biggest single impediment there might well be the government's own mismanagement of its own spectrum allocations?
I think you worded it very well.
Thank you.